All right, let's move on to the next slide. Oops, I'm having some technical difficulties. Give me 1 second. All right, there we go. So welcome again. What we'll talk about today is the Historic Preservation Toolkit that we prepared to help preservationists reach the resources they need to preserve historic places in their community. And we will, of course, start with an introduction of our speakers. We will then talk about getting started with historic preservation, what things you absolutely need to know to get started. Then we'll move on tactical tools for historic property owners, and we're going to give some examples of local historic preservation. Of course, there is going to be a Q&A at the end, and please feel free to ask your questions then, or type them into the chat during the call, and we will address them. Before we begin with the Florida Historic Preservation Toolkit, I just wanted to give a quick, brief reminder or introduction to anyone new about the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. We are the statewide nonprofit for historic preservation in Florida. We were founded in 1978 by a group of people that banded together to try and save historic treasures like the historic Florida Capitol, which was under threat at the time. And our mission is the preservation in the inclusive sharing of diverse architectural, historical, and archaeological heritage of Florida. We have 4 areas we focus on, namely legislative advocacy, connecting historic preservationists all over the state, education, which includes programs just like our Lunch and Learn today, and of course our annual conference, which this year is going to take place in Tallahassee, and we hope to see you there. And finally, stewardship of the Florida Trust House in 1910, Queen Anne Victorian House here in Tallahassee, and of course, various easement properties throughout the state. And with that said, I invite our speakers to introduce themselves.
Daphne, you have to introduce yourself. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but who are you and what are you doing?
I'm sorry, Melissa?
You have to introduce yourself.
Oh, of course. I forgot. So, hi everyone. My name is Daphne Kirkpatrick. I am the Business and Communications Manager at the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. And thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry for that misstep. Let's go on to Shannon. Thank you, Melissa. Shannon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Shannon Cook. I'm the Executive Director of the Tallahassee Trust for Historic Preservation. So we get to work on the local level with wonderful organizations like our statewide partner, the Florida Trust. So we're very happy to be located in the capital and just get to be neighbors with them. So we love partnering. And we love expanding more on really focusing on the local level of historic preservation, because while it's so wonderful to have these statewide organizations connecting us all, it's the boots on the ground in our individual communities that get our day-to-day work done under this supervision of the whole state. So at the Tallahassee Trust, we've been doing that work in Tallahassee and Leon County for countless decades at this point. We some sort of form of us has been around in Leon County since the 1960s. So we're very proud to still be in our community. And we're governed by many different things that we'll get to in the portion when I speak, but I've been in preservation for over 15 years and look forward to continuing our great work, not only in Tallahassee and Leon County, but seeing what everyone else is up to in the entire state. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Very nice to have you here. Adrienne, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Burke. I am co-principal of Community Planning Collaborative based here in Jacksonville, Florida. We're an urban planning and historic preservation consulting firm. I've spent also about 15 years in the preservation world professionally, working primarily for local government with a little bit of a short stint in the nonprofit world as well. And I'm a former trustee for the Florida Trust. So very much a cheerleader for this organization and happy you're all here with us today.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thank you for joining us. And then let's move on to Melissa.
Thank you. So welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Wyllie, and I'm the CEO and president of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. And Daphne has done a great job of telling you who we are and what we do. So thank you for sharing that. But the toolkit is just something that was very important to us and to our board of directors. So we're very glad and excited that it's come to fruition and to share some more information with y'all about it today. So Daphne, if you're ready, I think we can move along.
Wonderful, thank you. Adrienne.
Yeah. Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to jump in here and get us started talking about the Florida Preservation Toolkit, which is a really exciting new resource to have here in the state. Just a little bit about how this got started. The National Trust for Historic Preservation helped fund the creation of this toolkit. And we got started on it last summer, I think. Gosh, it's been like going on a year. I think we started having these conversations about getting this started. And
Adrienne, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we also started the year before surveying people. So it was like a year of work
that's
and
right.
then like a year of surveying to learn what people wanted to know more about.
Thank you. That's right. So yeah, it's been a couple year project. So yeah, yes, thank you for that reminder. So yeah, the trust got started the year before that, with surveying people about what kind of information they needed, what information would be helpful to them, to have, kind of on hand as far as preservation goes, and helping them with their advocacy work and just, kind of hands-on work with preservation. And that information really informed what has now gone into the toolkit. So yeah, thank you. Melissa reached out to us and our firm last year about partnering to work on the toolkit once all that information had been gathered. And so we are very happy to have been part of this project at CPC. And also not with us today on the call, but another partner is Sarah Marsom. She's a preservation consultant who helped with this project, and a lot of her really great illustrations are in the document as well as content. And Karen Essick was the graphic designer who helped us, who's really fantastic. So just a little bit about how we got to the toolkit. Let's see. Oh, Daphne, that's right. You're doing it. Thank you. So a little bit about the toolkit, and the website is there, and maybe Melissa or someone can drop the link in the chat to the toolkit. But all sections of the toolkit are available online. They're accessible to anyone who can get them there. And the goal of this toolkit is really to provide people, whether you're brand new to preservation or you've been in the field for a long time, with information you need to protect and advocate for the historic places that are important to you, whatever that might be. So it is a really robust toolkit. It's technically 5 chapters, 6 or 7 if you add, the introduction and the resources section. But it is, I mean, I'm biased, but I think it's one of the best resources I've seen for preservation in the years I've been working in preservation. And some of the main topics are Preservation 101, the sort of legal and regulatory framework of preservation in the US, hands-on information, how to be proactive about preservation, and then advocacy. And it's really designed to be very user-friendly, very lots of graphics, and it's colorful, so it's not, the boring preservation resources that you might think of in the past, perhaps. Next slide,
Adrienne,
please.
I'm gonna
Mhm.
interrupt and say that you
Please.
are not biased because
Okay.
we forgot to introduce the toolkit as the award-winning
True.
toolkit because we just had the Tallahassee Leon County Historic Preservation Awards, and this project won for preservation education, and it was, yes, very, very exciting. It was very well vetted by our panel of judges and went through rigorous, scrutiny. So I'm here to say that this is an award-winning toolkit. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I am glad you mentioned that. I have to remember to say that now when I introduce it, the award winning, right? So yeah, just before we get into some of the more specific parts of the toolkit that Melissa's going to talk about, I just wanted to share a little bit about some of what informs kind of the lens of the toolkit. And not only did we want it to be user friendly, we wanted it to be really accessible to a wide variety of people with different interests in preservation. So just for the folks joining us today, I'm curious, what does historic preservation mean to you? And feel free to drop it in the chat. This is a question that always has a lot of different answers. So we're very curious, just to have the conversation about it. And then I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you want to take a second and just drop some ideas in the chat about what preservation means to you, would love to see what some of your answers are. And yeah, cool. Julie's redoing a historic building. Thank you for being a steward. Cultural heritage, celebrating what makes our places unique. Nice. Awesome. Yeah, keep them coming. Connecting people, love that. Property values, local stories, people who've lived before us, stewardship. Yeah, amazing. All really great things. So Daphne, do you want to go to the next slide? You guys we're all on the same page here. So the toolkit does talk a little bit about this, what historic preservation means. These are just a couple of, some quotes that were collected from folks, including the first keeper of the National Register of Historic Places, and, very similar to some of the things we heard from you all here in the chat today. Next slide, please. So historic preservation, and this, gets into how we're thinking about how we approach the toolkit. The standard definition of preservation, and one that most people are probably familiar with, is most often viewed as protection of the built environment. So it's, focusing on architecture, whether that's a building or an object. It might include landscapes, sites, cemeteries, bridges, lighthouses, there's a variety of things, but it's typically that built environment piece. And then in the toolkit, we talk about this distinction between historic resources and cultural resources. So where a historic resource might specifically focus on the history of a place, it fits within this larger umbrella of cultural resources. And cultural resources can include things like sites and architecture, but it also might include things like language, food, or music. So next slide. And of course, all the photos you're seeing are from in Florida. So why do we preserve? Does anyone want to chat that? Oh, sorry. Yeah, definitely don't tell them.
Sorry.
What are some ideas you guys might have in the chat of why do we do this? Why do we do preservation? Some of it, like actually the last comment in the chat right now, is stewardship. That's a great one. Preserving, celebrating stories. Actually, a lot of these kind of relate, right? Like what is preservation and why overlap a little bit, property values. Is there anything else anyone wants to add to the chat about why? Why do we do this? And I will say, while you're thinking about it, I think this is probably the biggest piece of helping people understand why preservation is important, is getting them to this why. Because that's where I think you really make the most connections with people and helping them understand what historic preservation is. Yeah, Fatima, we won't know these people or stories existed, responsibility to history, can't know our heritage and have pride and cultural roots if we don't know. Those are great answers. So yeah, Daphne, do you want, just in the interest of time, losing character, sustainability, transportation, accessibility, future generation. Yeah, amazing. All these great things. So I won't go through this slide and read every single one, but just to highlight, in addition to some of the things that you all mentioned here in the chat, yeah, strengthening civic pride, strengthening the economy. There is definitely an economic connection between preservation and the economy. That can be through things like heritage tourism or, construction projects, preserving the spirit of a place, connecting generations, and storytelling is a really big one that actually we get into in the toolkit quite a bit as well. Next slide, please. And then, oh yeah, I'm almost done with my part, guys, I promise. Cultural heritage, I mentioned that cultural heritage is that kind of larger umbrella, and historic resources fit into that umbrella. And then within cultural heritage, that is broken into tangible and intangible, which is what I was mentioning earlier. Tangible is something like a physical artifact or a historic building. Intangible are those practices, knowledge, skills, traditions that perhaps aren't as easy to quantify or figure out how to preserve, but we definitely had this lens with the toolkit, thinking about this larger cultural heritage umbrella. Preservation is definitely moving in the direction of not just focusing solely on architecture. And so don't have to necessarily answer these questions here, but just for you all to be thinking about, what are some examples of those tangible and intangible heritage examples in your community? How can we think about protecting those intangible heritage resources? And are there different reasons? So we talked about the why. Are there different reasons why we would look to preserve maybe a historic structure versus something like the traditional foodways you see in the photo here on the left? Next slide. Yeah, and then before I turn it over to Melissa, just in the chat as well, what are some threats to historic resources? This is another why, of course, is the physical protection of these sites or these traditions. What are some of the things, especially in Florida, that are facing our historic resources? I like that unhinged development. I like that term. Ignorance, yeah. Lots of people don't even know. I think we see that a lot in Florida. People who move here from somewhere else might not even be aware that Florida has an incredibly rich history. Neglect, yep, definitely. Insurance, that's a good one. That one's increasingly becoming an issue. Flooding and termites, yep. Yep, for sure. Lack of funding, yes. Climate, especially like Jenny mentioned, flooding, climate change issues in general, money, yes. All of the above, right? So Daphne, if you want to move to the next slide, you can see the things you mentioned here reflected, and including, actually it was in Tallahassee. So when the toolkit was getting ready to be rolled out, we did a couple of community workshops in Tallahassee and Jacksonville. And a few of these were added from that Tallahassee session. People talked about politics. I mean, just political will to do this is often a challenge. Defining what is significant, who gets to define what's significant, relevance, why should people care when there's so much else going on? There are a whole bunch of reasons why historic resources are facing these threats. And so the toolkit, hopefully, is designed to be a really comprehensive resource for people in their communities to have the knowledge and information to, help work in the face of these threats and do the good work on the ground, like Shannon mentioned, the local levels where things really happen. So this is really intended really happen as far as like specific sites and that type of thing. There's often really grassroots on the ground support at the local level. So hopefully this guide will be a great resource for people working in their communities. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Adrienne. That is wonderful, and a wonderful kind of contextual overview of what we were hoping to achieve. And to Jenny and some other folks on the chat who were saying some of the threats are weather related and storm related. I'm sure all of us have seen the NOAA guidance that this is going to be, a historically challenging hurricane season we have starting up in like what is it, like 3 days, 4 days? I don't even know. Very soon. So, you know, I think for reasons like that, reasons for all of the things that Adrienne talked about, you know, we wanted to get this toolkit out there to help the people who were on the ground getting this work done. So I guess I wanted to start taking a step back and say, you know, when we did these sessions in locations around the state as we were launching this, and even as we do lunch and learns and other deeper dives with folks, I always like to ask, you know, what does historic preservation mean for you? And Adrienne did a great job walking us through that. But I'm glad we did that to level set, because I will say many of you know that there is some, not necessarily pushback, but there is some real rethinking, I think, in preservation. Is preservation just about a building, or is preservation something more? And you can see we've kind of put our flag out there to say that for us, preservation is a longer lens, a broader view that includes cultural heritage. It includes the stories that can be told even when the building is lost. So I think it's good for us all to kind of really think through that and realize where we are in the movement, the preservation movement overall. And I guess to that point, you know, I always like to say also that historic preservation is something that we can all be a part of. It does not require you to have any particular educational background or life experience, professional experience. I think everyone can be a part of protecting the historic places in their community that matter to them. But with that said, preservation is also very hard and tricky and complex. And to really get in there and move the needle, sometimes you need to know what you're dealing with. And so that is what we were hoping to accomplish through this toolkit, is to provide easily accessible information that can kind of help people who are starting out get where they need to be to make a difference in their communities. So thank you so much to Adrienne and to Shannon, to everyone who participated in these conversations, that shared information in the surveys about what would help them do this work. We're really grateful for you. So Daphne, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So we're going to talk about one section of our toolkit that Adrienne mentioned, of the 5 tactical tools for historic property owners. This was something that we heard probably most often when we did these surveys, because we were mindful of reaching out to people beyond our regular sphere of influence. So we didn't just ask everyone at like Preservation on Main Street, our educational conference every year. We really made efforts to kind of get out of our usual general stakeholders audience and hear from a broad array of folks. And this was something that we heard quite a lot of. So Daphne, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Maybe this slide should have been first, but either way, it's helpful for homeowners. It's helpful for everyone to understand. It really made a difference in the way that I kind of view preservation. But please know that preservation happens in these 2 different buckets, sort of. We are on the nonprofit side. Shannon's on the nonprofit side. We are, well, you actually straddle the line. You're tricky. We'll let you talk about you. She's a unicorn. But I, for sure, at the statewide nonprofit level, live on the nonprofit side. So we do advocacy. We can talk to lawmakers. We can ask for specific legislative outcomes. We can lobby. We can, you know, go out in the community and make a lot of noise, because, you know, we're a nonprofit. We can do stuff like that. So that is kind of our role in the nonprofit world and in the preservation world. But we also need the regulatory side. And I think Adrienne mentioned some of that in her presentation. But to do local preservation, to do broad preservation, you have to understand, if you're in a historic district, what the overlay might be, what your guidelines say. You know, how are you going to be compliant with the local regulations that exist? And then, of course, around that is the county guidelines that might exist depending on where you live. And surrounding all of that is the State Historic Preservation Office and their guidelines and the tools that they offer and the work that they do, which is very important to support preservation in the state of Florida. And then around all of that is the work that's done at the federal level through the Department of Interior that provides the guidance for how we do preservation work around the country, how to do it right, and also the National Park Service. So Daphne, if you wouldn't mind kind of moving on. So because we were mindful of our audience being not just professional folks that are in the field doing preservation work, but engaging with a broader audience, we provided kind of this level of information very mindfully. So while we're on the hands-on guide to preservation, here's kind of like a checklist for getting started. You start with a plan, you write it down, you begin with the outside, you determine the scope of the project, what were the materials that were used. We start kind of at this very highest level to get people really kind of funneled in. Thank you, Adrienne, for sharing that. To how they can actually do the work of hands-on preservation for their historic resource. Daphne? So then we also talk in the toolkit, we drill down a little bit further into terms that people need to know when they are considering a historic preservation or renovation project, restoration project. What is the kind of work that you are interested in doing? Is it preservation? Is it reconstruction? Is it rehabilitation or adaptive reuse? And then we dive into these different definitions, what it means, and then how it could impact, the use of the building. Daphne? And then we keep going, we dive a little deeper and we talk about like specifically how to do that work. So if you've decided that what you're doing is adaptive reuse, then here's where you get started. And then we kind of like take that down and outline what that looks like. And then we kind of have in purple throughout, like just sort of helpful tips or helpful hints. So we kind of inject that throughout the toolkit to just to keep people focused on these important preservation things that we're trying to get done. And then I think our next slide, I'm just gonna, okay, it's a video. So we have some videos that we've injected in here so people can actually see it in progress. They can see what it looks like when a preservation architect goes out in the field. So we'll just listen to this for a second. Oh. Daphne, we can't hear it. I don't know if you can.
I'm not sure why. It should have sound playing.
Well, just let the video run and I'll try to narrate it.
Okay.
There's the floor truss. This is JJ Scott. He's a preservation architect, and he's talking about what he does when he goes to a historic resource, a historic building. And he talks about the process of looking at the roof. And so he's saying all kinds of smart things. And then he talks about looking for wood rot. And this is the floor truss house. So he's doing a little bit of preservation shaming for us here, but we've got a maintenance plan, don't worry. So we'll put the link into the chat that would take you directly to that video if you would like to see it. But he talks about all those specific components that we looked at the other side. He kind of goes into it in a little more detail and shows examples of what that looks like. Because again, we were hoping to make this be a user-friendly tool that people can use to like actually do the work of preservation. Daphne, you can go on. If y'all haven't seen the floor truss house, come and see us. We'll do a giving back day and we can all just do work. All right, so again, we're back in the hands-on preservation component of the toolkit. We also talk about really important things that Shannon's going to go into a little more details on here. But, is the work you're going to do, is it going to require a building permit? People ask that quite a lot. Or, if I'm in a historic district, do I need to get a certificate of appropriateness? But don't worry, elsewhere in the toolkit, we explain what a certificate of appropriateness is. We don't assume that people are born knowing that. And then we give tips for how people can learn more about their property, where they sit, if they're in a historic district, the kind of permits they might need, all those kind of details are in there as well. Daphne, if you wouldn't mind. We also have really helpful tools that we've worked with preservation architects and other folks from around the state to think about what is a maintenance checklist that you're going to need. And it's actually like in the format that you could just like kind of print it out and actually use it as a checklist. But here's the things that you're going to need to think of all the time with your historic building. So we give examples of what that looks like here by season. Go ahead, Daphne. And then we give people helpful reminders. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't be scared. You don't have to do everything at once. And then we go into some detail about how you could prioritize the work that you need to be done. And we kind of really try to keep this with the lens of the fact that we are in Florida. So in Florida, we have different priorities for our buildings than in other places. Like for us, obviously, with storms that are going to be coming in during hurricane season, that is a huge issue for us, something for us to be very mindful of. But when you work with folks or look at other similar resources in other states, for them, it might be, maybe they're going to get a lot of snow. winter storms, drought, things of this nature might be something they focused on. So our resource, we try to really keep focused for Florida's historic places. Go ahead, Daphne. And that is everything that I was going to share, just about more details on the toolkit itself. Daphne's put the link in there. We will also do the link to the video there so you can check that out. But please just keep in mind any questions you might have for the Q&A for later.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. Well, like I said, I'm going to be giving some more very specific examples for Tallahassee and Leon County. We do have a joint dual government here where we have a city commission and a county commission. And so we get ordinances and regulations from both of those. Now, in your community, it's probably set up a little differently. And I can guarantee you that there's not another organization that exists quite like the Tallahassee Trust, where we get to enjoy both sides of working on the nonprofit sector, doing a lot of education and outreach, which is why we get to partner and do wonderful things like this. But then the other half of what we do is the regulatory portion, as Melissa was alluding to. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that, but in every community, it's going to vary slightly. So that's what we mean by saying that preservation happens on the local level. It wouldn't be able to happen in any of our individual communities if we didn't have this national framework that set up and established all these rules. And then within that, each state expands upon that and gives us the guidance that we operate under at the local level. But it's the local rules and laws and regulations that govern what happens in each individual community. So we'll get calls, especially being in the capital, where it'll be someone in a different city saying, I'd like to do this to my building. And I say, why I support that. That's a wonderful thing. We want you to preserve it. But the things that you're going to physically be able to do to your building or site are going to be different than what we can do in our community with our rules. So that's where things get a little confusing for someone who is brand new to preservation. And that's the gap where the toolkit comes in, the award-winning toolkit that we're really, really glad to have. But I will say that absolutely it has something for everybody, because even as preservation professionals, there are parts to it where we immediately can point to it for guidance. It's helpful for me. It's helpful for all of us. So this is a general overview for Tallahassee, Leon County, but I use it and you can use it as well. So Adrienne and Melissa gave us just such a wonderful, if you want to go ahead and get us going, Daphne, overview of why we preserve and how massive that definition is going to be. But when you really think of it, you know, Melissa gets to look at these big statewide priorities like we talked about, especially the storms and things like that. But in our individual and local communities, we're all going to have a very different reason, because some of them, some of these communities in Florida have very specific, I think Adrienne was talking about, like cultural heritage tourism and things like that. You know, immediately you think of somewhere like St. Augustine or something like that. You know, you're going there to see the history. So depending on which community we're in, we have a different priority. And I recommend that whatever community you are in, see if you can figure out where your local government is coming from. As Adrienne mentioned, we tweaked a few things in the Tallahassee talk, because our preservation is very heavily overseen by our local government. So there's a lot of that puts different parameters on some of the work that we can do. And we have to have a lot of support from our local government in terms of funding, and in order to do the really big scale preservation projects that we need to do in our Tallahassee and Leon County community. So take that as the first step for you. Find out just about the local climate and the environment in your own community, and see, you know, how this will be approached. The second thing I can recommend is go find your own Tallahassee Trust, who is in your local community. And if you're in Tallahassee and Leon County, hi, Julie, I saw you. We will be working together. You will be talking to me or someone in my office. But I would recommend starting with the State Historic Preservation Office. You can call them, the Division of Historical Resources, Melissa, myself, any of us, Adrienne, any of us would be happy to point you to anyone or the appropriate organization in your local community. So if you skip down to the bottom here where it says certified local governments, Tallahassee and Leon County participate in the federal program under the National Park Service, which is the Certified Local Government Program, which comes through the state level. As we had Melissa's beautiful arrangement there, we have the national, the state, and then it trickles down to myself and our organization at the Tallahassee Trust for Historic Preservation. And so we're able to do the regulatory work that we do through the Certified Local Government Program. Now you get that really big mouthful because you can go and search Florida CLGs and look to see if your city or your county or wherever the area you are is a registered certified local government. And if that's the case, then you do have access to some extra funding and some extra programs. There are also other types of preservation organizations out there, nonprofits, all types of things. They vary from community to community. Tallahassee and Leon County have a very different setup than other parts of the state. So the first two things to do would be see, if you can find that organization. If not, give us a call, and two, see what the climate's like in your area. And that will really direct how you can take this toolkit and use these things to make tangible changes or preserve in your particular environment. And so we're going to look at how we do it in Tallahassee. And we have, yes, definitely some limits and challenges to our everyday work, but we've had a lot of victories, and we want to keep on expanding our scope of what we're doing as well. So keep us moving forward, Daphne. Let's see what we got. Okay, so we just talked about storms. Tallahassee, if you didn't know, about a week before our preservation awards in May, got hit by some devastating tornadoes in preparation, just a little preview of hurricane season. So this picture is actually from that Amtrak station that was winning an award for the rehabilitation work that they had done, that the week before the awards got completely devastated again. So the architects were at the award ceremony. They were very sad, but they were going to go and do it again, so it just shows you our work is never done. But this happened to be the picture from there of one story that, we really turned that night into a story of resilience, that we know hurricanes are coming, but 3 random tornadoes, that's just part of living where we live. And we love where we live. And I don't know about you, I want to preserve where we are. I wouldn't want to be telling the story of anywhere else than where I am. And it's so important to tell that. And things like that, even though they're a setback, we look forward in ways to preserve. So I think that this was a very, very timely topic going into hurricane season. And I wish you all safety. So we are governed by, like I said, locally different ordinances. And in Tallahassee and Leon County, we have the city ordinance and we have the county ordinance, which makes my job super fun. Some of them cross over and some of them have separate areas. So that's what you'll look at when you're looking at the regulatory process. If you're doing hands-on work, of your ordinance should be a good guideline spelling out what you can and cannot do. So in Tallahassee and Leon County, we have what's called the Architectural Review Board. You'll see that called so many different things, but it's all generally means the same thing. Review commissions. I'm sure, Adrienne, you probably have a list of like 50 different names. And so when you do need, as Melissa was saying, a permit or a certificate of appropriateness, when you get to that point where you're assessing a building or a site, it will trigger the need to either go before a review board or come in to get a staff review from us, depending on what type of work you're doing, whether it's regular maintenance or some sort of significant change or update to the property. So we have all sorts of those things spelled out in our guidelines. Oh, you were good, Daphne. You can go ahead. And then in Tallahassee, it's actually a zoning mechanism. So depending on your community, it may function a little bit differently. So people will call us and immediately want to say, hey, money is our other biggest obstacle, weather and money. We'd really like to get some funding for a historic property. And we say, okay, so if we assess it, we have, as you see here, there are criteria for getting it locally listed. So the Tallahassee Trust for Historic Preservation also oversees our local register of historic places. So to be listed on that, you do get access to preservation funding that our city provides, but you do have to meet the preservation criteria like we have on here. I think many of you are familiar with this: 50 years old or older, the integrity, design, setting, materials. But like Adrienne also talked about, we are factoring in a lot of cultural heritage as well, and different things other than just what you would typically think of as, you know, a really perfect high architectural example of something. We want to make sure that we're preserving for the entire community, not just, you know, pristine examples of something that may not be accessible to everyone. So we try to be mindful and inclusive of that in our assessments for criteria. We have a few districts in Tallahassee that do have contributing sites. You can go ahead, Daphne. Our biggest residential district is the Myers Park Historic District, and unfortunately we are dealing with them a ton right now because the tornadoes just ripped, you see that beautiful golf course, right through all of that. There was a portion called Woodland Drives. They're talking about calling it like Sunshine Drive or something. The trees are gone. We've had a lot of damage. And so what happened was a lot of these people knew they were in a historic district, but then folks were like, well, what do I do now? We have small amounts of funding available for historic properties, depending on eligibility, and we have a way to shepherd you through the permitting and certificate of appropriateness process. So the main thing that we've been doing is trying to get out there that we're an organization that's here, we can help you. So if something like this does happen in your community in preparation for hurricane season, it's probably good to locate this organization near you now, beforehand, because, you know, as these things happen, they get flooded with requests. Also, funding limited, very limited. So some communities, it's a first come, first served basis. I know in Tallahassee, we have a pot for the whole year. And once that pot runs out, it will be renewed again the next year, usually, hopefully. But it's always a timely thing. So especially living in Florida, I would recommend just getting to know where you are and what's available to you and if you qualify for it. So now, before the storms come in and we start getting all these calls and we get to our busy season, this would really be a perfect time to find out how this exists in your area. So we can go ahead, Daphne. So Myers Park is a beautiful mix of architectural styles. It's got lots of parks and like I said, the country club. And most of these were from the 40s and 50s. You can go ahead and we'll start seeing a couple examples of these, Daphne. We've got some beautiful, let's see, yeah, photos of these. So I can tell you right now that that house right behind the marker got walloped in the storm. So these are our active, you know, repairs that we're doing. So the next couple of slides are just to show some architectural styles. So you may think, hey, I know I already live in a neighborhood that looks kind of like this. It's old, it might be protected. Call and find out. A lot of people don't know that they're listed in a historic district or that they have some sort of historic regulation on them, or that they may qualify to have historic regulation on them if they want to. So that's another thing. We say, you know, or maybe it's not me, it's my aunt who lives in this home and I know that she's really looking forward to keeping this, or, you know, someone, you know, whoever it is. The more that we can think of just outside of our own place and what we're looking at every day, this is such a beautiful resource for the whole community, not just the people who live in Myers Park, but well, you saw the railroad station we talked about that got hit. That's part of a district in Tallahassee, an arts district that got hit by the tornado as well. And folks are just devastated that we've, you know, had such damage to these historic buildings. So like Adrienne was saying, it's not just your individual building as well. They contribute to the whole makeup of the community and tell our whole story. So if we start losing these buildings one by one, then we lose the fabric of everything altogether. So really, we like to talk about broadening and widening the lens. And if we can help you through these little tiny individual pieces or help you see it in a different way, that's really important as well. So Daphne, I'll let you go ahead and go through these couple of just beautiful, some of the things that we have going on in Myers Park. Keep on going. But we also have, go till we get to new construction. You may have questions in your community about, what do we call it? Unhinged development. So, depending on your political climate and, what's going on, there are also rules and regulations about new construction. So Myers Park is one example in Florida, in Tallahassee, where we do regulate, for the zoned parcels there, what can and cannot be constructed and try and make sure that it is compatible construction. So as we were talking about, you will lose small pieces. It's very, very incredibly rare to have an entirely intact district. I could be wrong. Adrienne, correct me, but that's why we have contributing and non-contributing buildings and things like that within a district. But we have to be able to work within the framework of what's happening in our everyday world, and that right now is driven by new construction. So you may think that that doesn't have anything to do with preservation, but it is indeed a really big part of what we deal with. So if you are either adding on to something that's historic or adding into a place that has historic fabric around it, that is something that we regulate and we'll provide guidance on as well. Okay, Daphne. So I will very quickly wrap up with our other two special character districts in Tallahassee are what you would more typically think of as the districts that we get for our heritage tourism and preservation tourism, things like that. But it really is helping us open up the conversation to send folks to places that they may not have initially had on the map. Like I saw Adrienne had a wonderful picture of our Smoky Hollow commemoration in Tallahassee and Leon County. So traditionally, something like the Calhoun Special Character District had been placed on the National Register in the 70s. Those were our preservation priorities, to preserve these really, high architectural styles. Well, we've discovered that the box is so much bigger, and every story that plays a part in our community has a place. And so we are really starting to expand, having these districts and encompassing maybe some of the other examples of communities that have been demolished, that have had urban renewal, that maybe are no longer completely intact, and they are also as well deserving of recognition and having their story told. So the Calhoun Special Character District is a beautiful one that was built at the end of the 1800s, mainly in Tallahassee, and it is the core of our big houses that we have left. Daphne, if you want to go through, we've got some pictures of those. So these are the ones that when you think preservation, you typically think of these houses with a historic marker. Well, a lot of work has been done for many of these houses, and probably in your community as well. So it's time that we start looking at, things that are aging in, that have become 50 years old or older, because these properties are well over 50 years old and have been documented. You can keep going through these photos, Daphne. And so that's really where we are in Tallahassee and Leon County, is while we lovingly attend to and steward these buildings and have to make sure that this is around and preserved for our future, we're also starting to incorporate, the larger story and how we can tell that as well. So yes, here's our Park Avenue district, and Park Avenue's got some really interesting adaptive reuse. You see that one on the left that says library, that is now actually adaptively reused as a bar. So we've had a couple really interesting stories of that in Tallahassee and Leon County lately. I bet you have as well in your community, because that's becoming a really incredibly popular thing to do for adaptive reuse. It's take something that once functioned some way and turn it on its head. And that is one of my absolute favorite parts of historic preservation, is the way that folks think outside of the box and save it for their communities and be able to tell a story in a different way, even if we're not using it as it was used 100 years ago, making it a new part, bring that as part of the community as well, and the fabric of how do we go forward with this story. Okay, Daphne. Well, I have chatted a lot. Let's see, we can wrap up a little here. But I'm happy to answer any questions about locally in Tallahassee or Leon County. I love that Julie, one of our applicants that we've been talking to, she actually is a wonderful example of one of our neighbors at the Tallahassee Trust is going through a specialized roof replacement. So they've come into our office, talked about, how do we do this from A to Z? How do we fill out the form? How do we go before the board? What's our timeline going to be? How do we get the decision? How do we move forward with the permitting process? And I like to think we've made it pretty easy, but that's the type of thing that these local organizations like myself and others around the state are here to help you with. We want to be historic preservation, not hysterical preservationists. So we want to make it easy for you and demystify the process. And I must say that this toolkit is a huge chunk of what was missing in the state of Florida. So it's helping demystify for the professionals, for everyone else. And oh, thank you, Julie. You said great. So she's in through the process. Yeah. So go find your me in your local area. And if not, call Melissa.
That's a great wrap up. That's perfect. So we have a few minutes that we've reserved for questions from y'all. So you can unmute if you'd like to and ask us a question. That is perfectly great. Or you can also type it up in the chat if you have a question that has kind of popped into your head listening to the presentation. So while you kind of think through that and get typing, I will just say again, thank you to Shannon and Adrienne for sharing your take on preservation in your perspective of it and the way that you can utilize the toolkit as part of what you do. So thank you for sharing those with us. We appreciate it. And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I have a question for you both. And then if anybody else wants to jump in, you can do that. But we talked a little bit about how you can be proactive with disaster planning. So Shannon, I think, and Adrienne, both of you probably have examples of this, but I love the idea of working on the front end to understand with your architectural review board or historic preservation commission, what does that process look like? Have ready, who do I talk to? Do you guys want to, either of you give any more, I guess, thoughts on that?
Yeah, Shannon, you probably have more recent experience if you want, and then I can jump in.
Well, I can speak for Tallahassee and Leon County. Like we've said, it kind of varies from community to community. But you should, like I would say, start with the Division of Historical Resources to see, first of all, if you are part of the certified local government program. And if you are, then there should be a coordinator in your community. There will be a list of those folks. They will have access to all of the ordinances that govern what you're doing. Let me see. Yes. So you can also go directly to, depending on the size of your community. I know some of the larger cities that might be a little bit more confusing to do, but they generally have a few more staff folks, so they might be a little bit more visible. Most communities will have some sort of preservation ordinance if they're going to be able to help you with some sort of funding and review process. So if you have a question about whether your community has that, I'm trying to think of where else to look for other than the list. Adrienne, do you have a thought about that? Other
Yeah,
than
I mean,
CLGs?
in the toolkit, we mentioned that, you can, of course, start with your local government's planning office, if they have
Yes.
one, or a building department. If it's a really small community, they might not have dedicated staff for that, but you could even contact like the city clerk or someone who can kind of help point you in the right direction. And then as far as, getting ready, I mean, the section that has the checklist on what to do for your property on a seasonal basis, the more you can prep in advance to help protect your property, the better. And there's a lot more you can do now, and especially if you have a government staff person that does preservation, they're probably pretty aware of things going on about, preservation is becoming a lot more flexible in most places, about being able to do some changes that help protect your property from things like flooding and things like that. So yeah, always reach out to your government first before you do anything, just to make sure, there's not some process you have to go through. Just will make your life a lot easier in the long run.
And I will say that in terms of planning, so what people don't realize is that the review process can take time. So it depends on where, what community you're in. So in Tallahassee and Leon County, depends on the type of work. It triggers either threshold, like I said, that we can do a staff review, which generally we can do within a few days. But if it does trigger a larger review by, your architectural review board, your historical commission, whatever that is, that process can take a little while, depending on what the work is, if it's tied to funding, that type of thing. Typically in Tallahassee, we have a meeting every month, but that means that we need to know about the work about 6 weeks in advance because of our legal requirements for public noticing and things like that. Now, as Adrienne said, we're trying to get a lot more flexible in historic preservation, meaning of materials, but also in terms of accessibility, us recognizing that some of these practices, if you have a hole, we need to fix that. You can't wait 6 weeks. So we are also trying to be adaptable to that as well. But that's something that we found is shocking to people is every once in a while, they're not prepared for how long the regulatory process may take in some circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. And really quick, I saw we have a great question in the chat just very quickly before we turn to that. Something else we note in the toolkit too is people are not prepared for how long it takes to actually find a contractor to do the work. And so especially when you're in a community that's had recent damage or something like that, vetting and understanding who might be able to do the types of projects you need early on so that when you are ready, they're available is really important too. So,
It's an excellent point.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. That was great. Another question we just got was, I'll read it in case anybody is like driving and they can't read the chat. It says, our biggest issue regarding advocacy is deciding when and how to engage on various development projects. Does the toolkit offer, or does anyone on the call have a matrix or rubric they use to determine when their organization will engage for or against a particular issue, or what works for you? So we can open that up to the larger group here. I did pop in the chat the link to our advocacy section of the toolkit. But I think that you're maybe looking for sort of a more granular, like if this, then kind of flow chart situation. I can tell you on our end, because we are a nonprofit, so we're on that side of the preservation framework. What we are doing right now is we're instituting through our regions, we're just now kicking it off actually, a listening campaign where we are just talking to stakeholders within our community and listening to what's important to them, because a big part of what we do is our legislative advocacy here during the Florida legislative session. And so we want to make sure that we've heard what, the people of our state, everyone in our state thinks are important ways that we can impact the legislative process to positively support preservation. And so through that process, we've learned things that I hadn't actually thought of yet. Maybe, well, I've thought of it, but I've heard that it is very important to have things like perhaps a standard form for real estate professionals in the state of Florida that is a historic preservation disclosure. So I disclose that we are in a historic district as a seller, and I disclose as the buyer that I know that I am in a historic district, and that's what that means. So we don't have a tool like that. And maybe that is a place and a way that we should, focus our advocacy going forward. So we're going to listen throughout our regions and hear kind of what bubbles up to frame our advocacy for next March. But I think another piece that you're probably talking about is like the on the ground when something is about to be condemned and raised. What do we do? Like, do we actively go online? Do we do big social media posts about it? Do we kind of like chain ourselves, maybe literally or figuratively, in front of the building? And I think that is something that you would have to determine as a nonprofit with your board. I think it's important that when we as nonprofits take stands, that it cannot be like how Melissa Wyllie feels about a particular action, but how we as an organization view action in terms of our mission and who we serve. So that's probably not helpful. Manny, do you want to ask a follow-up or drill down any deeper on that?
I was gonna jump in really quick if
Oh,
I
yeah, of
could
course.
too. Yeah, so the toolkit doesn't get into that kind of level of like assisting an organization with making those calls, just because that is very specific to each organization. I worked for a small nonprofit where that was something we worked with, and a couple of the things just to echo Melissa, it is really organization specific. So I would recommend almost like, they're at the beginning of the year or at some point during the year having an annual meeting with your board or group of volunteers if you're not that organized formally, just to talk about what are our priorities for the coming year and how do we want to um, navigate what we're going to engage with as far as advocacy. The organization I worked with at the time, I'm not sure what they're doing now, but was sort of starting to pivot more towards just focusing on like the larger developments, so that, they weren't so concerned with what an individual homeowner was doing necessarily, but unless it was a very significant demolition or something. But as far as like commenting on changes or new construction, they were like really starting to just move towards, we're just going to focus on the bigger projects. So it really is a conversation for your group, and how you want to make those calls.
And
And yeah,
I
and if
will,
you have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
you know, go.
Oh, and I was just gonna say, I know if Manny had anything else they wanted to add.
And I will just chime in on a general note of, as we're talking about all this proactiveness with storms and things like that. And if you are with an organization, the thing that happens to us in Tallahassee a lot is people assume that something is protected or assume that it's been listed on the local register just because it's old or significant, or everybody knows that. If you have even an inkling of anything that you are looking to preserve, find out its legal status well beforehand, because by the time folks come to me and say, hey, this is going to get demolished, well, the process to list it on the local register takes a very long time. So while we would love to swoop in, as the Hail Mary, it's a very long process. So it's that pre-planning where if we get several steps ahead of what's coming and it's less reactionary, that's what comes across my desk a lot, at least.
Thank you. That was a great question, Manny. And we can talk about that separately too. We've got to follow up here. Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, Manny. And then also, I think both Shannon and Adrienne said we have to be mindful of the overall brand of historic preservation, and we can't always. I think we have to be careful about always coming out as like hysterical and only talking about things that are going to ruin our community forever, but also balancing that with offering solutions and saying, here's how you can be proactive. So, that mindful balance and not always focusing on all of your bandwidth on the negatives, but of course that's a whole separate conversation. So we've had our hour-long conversation today, so thank you so much for joining us. If you have any other questions, you can email me or Daphne or Adrienne and Shannon. You're welcome. You can just email me and I can get you to Shannon and Adrienne because I don't think we have our contact us slide up. But thank you for your time today. This will be on YouTube as well. So we will hopefully see you soon.
Thank you,
The
everyone.
POMS conference. Are you guys talking about the POMS conference?
Well, it's number 4 on here. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought that was the last slide, Daphne. Well, it's come to POMS, Preservation on Main Street. It's preservationonmainstreet.com if you'd like some more information on that.
And I'm saying it because we want to show off Tallahassee and Leon County. So
yeah, all that tornado damage.
we're recovering.
All right. Here's the contact. Okay, sorry, Daphne. I thought that was the last slide for some reason. So anyone still on the call here, here's the contact info.
Well, I will also send that with a follow-up email. So if anybody missed it,
oh, perfect. Thank you, Daphne. I appreciate that. Jenny, do you have a question or are you just saying hi?
Just clapping.
Oh, it was a clap. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.